age, well, you can become very, very apparent actually just by using that expression to identify some children who may be very, very strongly literal and have no understanding. So
Yeah.
that, the thing of jokes and sarcasm and, pitch and tone of
Mm,
voice, there would there wouldn't be a strong indicator of that. Yeah, that social communication, that obviously where we have the unwritten speech. So those things that are not
mm,
said, yeah, and also some may not speak or have fairly limited speech. They will often understand more of what other people say to them than they are able to express. So that's
mm,
something that has also been very, very clear within a classroom. That some of the children that I've seen, and I'd like to see if you could also elaborate on this. That
mm,
they can actually understand more than they can express. They can understand maybe
mm.
a lot more around them than maybe they're given credit for as well. So I say where maybe on the in the concept of in terms of their social interaction and lack of, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a one-way street in terms of them not being able to understand social situations. It's maybe them maybe not being able to express that they understand it, if that
Mm.
makes sense.
Yeah, so if you've got some children on the spectrum are selective mute, and that means that they don't like the sound of their own voice, or their own voice is just too loud because they're hypersensitive.
Mm.
Um, so for those children, and I've worked with those types of children who are selective mute, and yeah, it's quite difficult to work out their level of understanding, because normally when we show that we understand something, we do it through speaking and
Mm.
saying, I understand what you're saying. But I think there's other ways to get around it. So if you just taught a lesson, or if you taught an idea to a child, and they're not able to express that they understand, you would then perhaps give them an opportunity, such as a task to do, where they can
Mm-hmm.
demonstrate their understanding. So something that's directly related to what you've taught them. Um, and that would give you an indication of whether or not they've understood.
The message of what you've communicated.
Mm,
Okay,
yeah.
brilliant. I'd just like to actually read a short story, and actually get
Hmm.
your views and your comments after
Okay.
this. Um, so this is reported in the Guardian. Once there was a 5-year-old girl, Gabriel,
Hmm.
and 5-year-old boy, and his family were at a
Yeah.
bookstore in the United States. Gabriel pushed the
Hmm.
girl. The girl's
Right.
angry mother began hitting Gabriel repeatedly and even told Gabriel's father that his son was wrong to hit her daughter. Gabriel's
Right.
father asked her to look into Gabriel's eyes and see for herself that he was different. After taking the time to relook at Gabriel, she started crying over what she had done, for she had realized that
Mm,
Gabriel was autistic. Reem,
mm,
or Gabriel's mother, who resides with the family in Texas, says this incident was a lesson for the family that their son will be held responsible for his behavior because he's not easily
mm,
identified as a person with, if you like, a disability. That's a real big
mm,
thing because when we say, autism, I mean,
mm,
because there are sometimes, autism, it can be very hard physically to identify straight away. Where you have, and if you have a
mm,
situation like that, I guess this is an important thing that we should communicate to families, parents out there, that you
mm,
should seek help. You should, and as a
mm.
society, we do need to ensure that we are open up discussions to, I mean, could you elaborate further and on your thoughts about this story or this incident, and if you have anything similar?
Yeah, so I think it's just about that kind of touches on the level that the rest of society are aware of people with disabilities. And that obviously I think needs to improve. We need to have greater awareness. Um, I would say from a teaching point of view,
Mm,
um, that I think we need to be really careful that we're not excusing certain behaviours in children, such as hitting, because they might be on the spectrum or have another type of impairment. That doesn't mean that we should punish them when things go wrong, like in the story, but I think proper behaviour and correct behaviour needs to be taught really well, so that these sorts of situations outside in the wider world aren't, don't happen. And that I would kind of look back on that story and hope that that boy had a really strong teacher who knew her stuff, or knew his stuff on how to teach, how we manage our emotions when someone does something to us that we don't like, and how we manage that in a non-confrontational way, and do a lot of work with him on that.
I mean, definitely.
So that it doesn't happen again.
The thing that I'd like to actually add is that mental health illnesses, conditions are becoming more prevalent in society. As we discussed last week, 95% of young offenders in juvenile prisons suffer from a mental health condition. 75% of them who are in prison, juvenile prisons, are undiagnosed until they get there. So, and this is at this moment, right, within the last 5 to 10 years. Now, if we think then people who have already gone through the teacher training program, are they getting the necessary teacher training to approach, and support children who have mental health conditions in the classroom? Because as an educator, being in the classroom is something that has almost been approached within the job that you are. But if you go to a specialist school, great, you'll get lots of training. Outside of that school, the question is, will you get that training as a teacher? Will you get that support as an educator to be able to deliver and support pupils who need that in the classroom? Because if you've got a classroom of 30 children and maybe two are on the spectrum, maybe another child has ADHD, and maybe another child or children are suffering from childhood trauma, as we'll discuss later, how do you make sure that you're catering for their needs? And what is it that I guess my question to you is, do you feel that as an educator you were properly prepared before going into the classroom, when to be able to approach and support children who have mental health illnesses?
I would say in my own experience, I wouldn't say it was perhaps as comprehensive as it could have been, but it was as comprehensive as it could be within the allotted time that I had, to train, because it's only sort of 1 year that you train as a teacher and that you go to sort of teacher training college. But I think that what needs to happen is that teachers need to continue to learn about different disabilities through continuing professional development. And that is where a good senior leadership team within the school comes in. And it's about identifying those needs with regards to specific children, and then kind of putting training in place in order to target those sort of deficits in understanding amongst teaching staff. But that is kind of on an ad hoc basis, I think. And I don't think that you can't learn everything. Yeah. It's almost impossible. It does kind of have to be on a need-to-know basis, depending on the children that are within that school, and the types of information that you need to know in order to support those children. So yeah, I think it's as comprehensive as it can be, but obviously that will vary across schools, because that depends on the senior leadership team, the types of training available to teachers, the level at which teachers are accepting to take on board information about specific children and implement particular practices. So I think it really is dependent on the situation, the individual. But I totally agree. I think that there should be a lot more opportunities available to learn about specific conditions in order to properly support a number of children.
Okay, so just two very last quick things before we go to our break. Obviously, one being, what support is out there, or what support should be put in place for a child with autism to, to progress, and actually more importantly, what just to touch on some of the challenges that some of them may face, some autistic pupils may face in the classroom, is as follows. Obviously, we mentioned and we commented about routine. So they obviously things like lunch times and break times, maybe they might find that difficult. Maybe also making friendships also could be a very perhaps difficult thing, and also them organizing and planning their own, if you like, activities. I've seen where things like packing a bag, or getting ready, those things would all be, that may all need to be done with support, with their support of an adult, implementing that, to get them into a routine of how to do these very, mundane, what we might say is basic tasks. Sorry, and they'll need support. So obviously those are some of the challenges, and then we said about like being hypersensitive, or even perhaps undersensitive. So also things like smell. So what I've witnessed is where children who, on the spectrum, who are extremely sensitive to smells in the classroom, in the house. So even if you perhaps, let's say for instance, if you're at home as a parent and you use maybe lavender spray around the house, and then your child maybe, maybe one day you decide to use a different spray, and maybe the child then reacts. But maybe initially, this is what we're talking about, typical scenarios, the child may not say that it's because that this smell has come out, but on the aftermath, that could be something that might appear, and it might present itself in having things like meltdowns and this kind of thing. So there's a lot of challenges that they would face, and I want you just to explore or even comment on some of the supports or interventions that are out there for children who have autism, please.
So there's lots of charities. So there's charities that work specifically with families, and they work with the entire family to work out sort of things and strategies that you can do, with your child, if you're in that situation. And it's sort of to get the whole family to understand kind of what's going on. So if you have those kind of anomalous behaviours, and you don't understand what's going on, it's to sort of support the whole family to really understand what's happening, and to make things a bit more open, and more supportive for that child. There's also other charities where they provide respite care for parents, which I think is really, really important, because if you have got a child who, is showing some quite extreme behaviours, that can be very difficult, and that can be very hard on yourself as a parent. And often parents think that they're not doing a very good job if they have a child that's presenting extreme behaviours. And I just want to say, actually, if you are a parent of a child that presents extreme behaviours or really difficult behaviours, you are doing a really good job, and you mustn't think that you're not. It's just a very, very hard situation. So don't be hard on yourself, because I think quite often it can go like that. And these charities that provide respite care, they sort of provide the parents with some time to themselves, so that they can, have a bit of time to get back to themselves and to sort of readjust. And that's really important, because it can be quite full on.
Well, I'm sure that even as an educator, teacher yourself, that even in the school day, you can imagine having children who have autism in the classroom is full on, let alone if you're a parent of a child and you are having to, not just work with, love and care for, for your child, and work with your child and have the same expectations. If you have one child who has autism and another child who hasn't, it can be, I guess it can be very, very difficult for any parents, any family members out there. So our love and our support is out to all those parents and families who are at home with their children who do have autism, or who are on the spectrum, or just in general who do have any sort of mental health condition. our thoughts and our
Mhm.
prayers are out there with you. And also, just to talk about a few more of the interventions, lastly, that are available with both within the class and outside of the classroom. Communicate. Well, they need help with this communication skills, social skills.
Mhm.
Imaginative
Mhm.
play is very, very useful. So taking part in role play, it can be quite a difficult thing, but if it's something
Mhm.
you persist with, it can be something quite useful to help children who are on the
Mm.
spectrum understand different social situations and place themselves within that without them knowing. Also. There are speech and language therapists who can help to work with that child who has speech and language difficulties, as well as occupational
Mhm.
therapists. And obviously, the first point is that you would, after you do get a diagnosis of ASD, then you would ultimately then have a caseworker. After you get a caseworker,
Yeah.
then there's so much things open up to you. But I think one of the key things is that you should be open as a family, as individuals, to knowing that this mental health condition is something that we shouldn't be ashamed about, and it is something that
Mm.
people do grow up with, and they do learn to, as we mentioned at the beginning, live a fulfilling life. And to
Mhm.
say that any child, because some myths that are out there are that children who do have autism can't develop emotional relationships and can't reciprocate. And actually, there is something that is actually quite dear to my heart that I wanted to actually share with the viewers. Um,
I'm
last
really sorry,
Sure.
Sia. It's actually breaking up. The phone's breaking up.
Okay, sure. That's fine. That's fine. If you can go, we can take it from here. Thank you very much,
Thank you
Miss
for having
Aliva.
me.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. So yes, listeners, I was just saying to you that, and everyone on the uh, on the station, that actually I wanted to share something that was quite personal and close to my heart, where there was a pupil in my class who's on the spectrum. And obviously, one of the misconceptions that is out there is that these children can't emotionally connect with anyone, but with the right support and with the right patience, with the right level of intervention, and with the right persistence, they can. And actually, one of these things that I'll show you here, and I'll explain to you what this is. So it says here to Mr. Huck, says, "Happy Eid. I am happy for you to eat, and I hope you had a nice celebration." There are, the child actually drew around their hand and put in there very meaningful things that were very relevant to myself and to herself as a connection, as a class teacher. And this was, for me, something that was a clear indicator that we had an emotional connection. So I will take a short break, viewers. So thank you very much, and I'll be back, inshallah.
Looks like I'm going to this wedding in a rangy then. They'll drop off the car and pick you up once you're done. Just give them a ring on 01798 397 916 or visit them online spmhired.com or find them on Instagram.
Looking for meat and groceries? Look no further than Waris Food Store in Walthamstow. Visit the store to view our special Ramadan offers. 420 Hull Street, Walthamstow, E17 9AA. Or for free delivery, call us on 0208 521 0000. We have fresh deliveries of poultry and vegetables every day. Waris Food Store in Walthamstow.
Reliance Solicitors fight to protect your legal rights. Our firm offers a wide range of services including immigration, family law, commercial law, civil litigation, personal injury, landlord and tenant disputes and employment law. Visit us at 602A High Road, 7 Kings, Ilford, IG3 8BU or call 0207 183 54.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, viewers. We have on the line with us today Maysoon El Gamati. Assalamu alaikum, sister.
Alaikum assalam.
And Jazakallah khair for being an amazing esteemed guest on the show for a second week running.
You're more than welcome.
Thank
No
you so
problem.
much. So just to recap on the last before the break that we had, we were talking about just ASD, ASC, sorry, um, and mentioning obviously some of the support that's out there. The fact that obviously it's not a treatment, there isn't a treatment, but there are lots of things that you can do to intervene, how to identify, and obviously the diagnosis, and how teachers can support with children who have autism. In the classroom, and how also families, and also mentioned the story, and also something quite dear to my heart as well, something that showed that a young pupil in my class could actually have an established emotional connection with the right persistence, time. And what we just want to actually move on to is actually talking about childhood trauma, and how that affects
Yeah.
children. But before we obviously start talking about childhood trauma, there are some really interesting statistics that I just like to read off for everyone, because obviously for this week and last week we have been talking about mental health, and we just want to raise the awareness of why we should be thinking about it as a community. And here's as follows: 16 million people in the UK experience a mental illness. That's 1 in 4 adults will experience a mental illness at some point each year in the UK, right? 3 in 4 mental illnesses start in childhood. 75% of mental illnesses start before a child reaches their 18th birthday, with 50% of mental health illnesses in adult um, uh, taking root before the age of 15. 10% of school children have a diagnosable mental health illness, and only 10% of them actually become apparent. The average wait for effective treatment is 10 years, or any sort of intervention. Now, just actually mentioning about, if you like, the concept of this whole waiting period. I know that I'm sure that yourself, Maysoon, and lots of educational practitioners out there, as well as people who work in CAMS and all the mental health services out there, as well as families, would perhaps also have a personal experience of this themselves. That actually, to get a child who you suspect as having a mental health illness diagnosed through the local CAMS service, it can be a really long time. And I'd just like to comment on one of my personal experiences. There was a child who I've worked with, and this child, it took, let's say, 2 years for the local service to actually come through with a diagnosis of ASD, although the parents and the whole family had strongly indicated this from the child was 4 years old. And after essentially when the child was approximately 8 years old, the child was actually given medication for ADHD, and that is a real touching thing, because when you think, if a child presents with, let's say for instance, aggressive behavior, and you and the family saying, well, look, this is what we know. We know this is a family. We've talked to lots of, and we need this support, and we need you to put this support in place. And obviously, I'm sure there are lots of things out there in terms of the CAMS being overstretched. So I think it's just a real plea to all families out there that do not give up. If you have a case out there for your child who has a mental health condition, and you don't think that the local services are supporting you in the right way, keep knocking on that door. If you knock on that door, eventually it will open. And if not, you take a sledgehammer and you break it through. No, I'm not advocating so or anything like that. But what I am saying is just that families know their children best, and you should just make sure that you work in line and alongside your teachers and other practitioners out there to ensure that you get the right support that that you are entitled to as a family. So that's why we are having these very strong conversations, because the practitioners out there are one side of the field, but the rest of society, who have the eyes and ears, who look at families, who look at children, in schools, who look at pupils, that makes up the majority of society. And it's those eyes that we need to uplift and increase their awareness, so that people can feel that they have a place, people can feel, as we mentioned last week, a sense of mercy, a sense of compassion. But let me not go off the rails too much. We are obviously talking about, in this particular discussion, traumatic stress and childhood trauma. Now, Maysoon, what is childhood trauma, please?
Childhood trauma is something that could traumatic experience. It could be being exposed to war, for example. It could be being exposed to violent acts, and it typically happens between the age of 0 to 6. So from being a baby, you could be involved in a traumatic incident, and it could be something that's kind of lodged in your kind of early memory, or it could be something you've witnessed, especially. You can kind of say developmentally, if you're quite young, 2, 3, 5 or 6, then your way of processing it, because obviously you haven't fully formed language yet, it's going to be different to the way of processing it as a slightly older child. So typically it's something that's quite traumatic that you've been exposed to from like I say, from 0 to 6 years old.
So it affects. So how does it affect a child then, in terms of, we're saying that traumatic stress, so just to sort of recap what you're saying. So traumatic stress or childhood trauma is when a child would witness something that is in an extreme case. Does it have to be an extreme case, or is it?
Generally, it's something that makes them feel very, very unsafe. So it's more than just, for example, having a bump, you kind of, falling over, that kind of thing. That's not stuff like that. It's something like, for example, I suppose if you look at the world today, there's a lot of countries that are at war. So a child who has grown up and known nothing but war, for example, bombs being overhead, violence, living in a very deprived area. Again, I'm talking about quite extreme cases where, looting, carjacking, knife attacks, these kind of things are quite common. So that a child doesn't have, what we would like to say, like a safe, regular upbringing where they're not exposed to anything that's traumatic. So what will happen, and some of the symptoms that you could have from that, for example, is being very clingy to their caregiver, being quite fearful of new situations. They're easily frightened. They might manifest in different ways. They could be quite aggressive. They could be quite impulsive. They're kind of making reckless, very instantaneous decisions. Difficulty sleeping will be a major aspect of that, and also because these early years are so important to children, that it will have a knock-on effect in terms of them developing just the regular kind of milestones that we would expect a healthy, functioning child to reach. So if you want just a brief summary, so for example, any children from the age of 0 to 2 exposed to trauma may demonstrate poor verbal skills, so they're lacking in terms of how they verbally communicate because that traumatic incident has affected them. Might have memory problems. They might scream or cry. That could be the PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder, that's recalling what's happened, and that could be something that's triggered through sensory aspects, like for example, it could be something they smell, something they see, a colour, a sound that they hear, maybe like a loud bang sound. All these things could maybe trigger that same traumatic incident to be recalled, and also if they're not able to process it, they don't understand it. That's another aspect. And then from 3 to 6, you might have a behaviour such as, for example, poor skills in terms of developmentally, and so, acting out in a social situation because they're fearful or they're unsure of how to act in the correct way, difficulty focusing on learning anything new at school, being verbally abusive, being unable to trust people and make friends, lacking self-confidence, imitating that abusive traumatic event is also something that can happen. And the physical manifestations that sometimes they may experience a lot of headaches, a lot of stomach aches.
Okay, before we go on the steam train, we're going far down the line. I just want to, because it's interesting actually, that commenting on childhood trauma, as well as our previous conversation with regards to ASD, some of the signs or symptoms, if you like, they cross over, where we have
Yeah.
like one symptom being, the inappropriate calling out or lack of understanding how to socially communicate or verbal skills. That seems like something also that is obviously present with a child who is on the autistic spectrum. So obviously, viewers, for everyone out there, this is important to be able to understand how to identify correctly what mental condition your child or pupil, if you're a teacher, that what they might have, because you may think your child has one thing because you see a list of maybe one or two symptoms, but again, we stress definitely going to trained professionals and having long conversations, and it's also depend on the age of the child or adult. So obviously, if a child, let's say for instance, we have maybe children who go through physical abuse or psychological abuse, which can induce obviously this traumatic episode. Obviously, you mentioned before about domestic violence, and just actually read off some statistics about England and Wales here, which you mentioned last week, that 9% of adults experience psychological abuse during childhood. 7% suffered physical abuse in childhood. 7% suffered sexual assault in childhood, and 8% witnessed domestic violence or abuse in the home during childhood. So there's a lot of obviously abuse that takes place, and we need to just make sure that we are approaching it in the right way. And so the question also here is, what are the long-term effects of traumatic stress? It goes on to say here that sometimes a child has feelings of depression and anxiety, which can go on for several weeks and may even get worse. If they go on for a long period of time, it is likely that the child may need help to help them feel better. If the traumatic experience was so bad that the child was in danger of being killed or seriously injured, they may have felt terrified, horrified, and helpless. As you mentioned, PTSD might follow a dreadful experience. It is difficult, however, to make a diagnosis in a child under the age of 7 years old. So even children who have gone through traumatic experiences under the age of 7 years old, it's very difficult to identify these things, because children like to play out so many different things in the classroom. I'm sure you know that as a teacher, even if you work with children who in the early years, some of them they rough play, they imitate what they see on the TV, and it can be very, very difficult to distinguish between something that is an indicator of something that maybe is linked to a childhood experience, and something that a child as just a child is sort of generally just playing around with in role play, if you like. Any comments?
Yeah, and I think sometimes there can be a delay in the diagnosis of it, because there's probably a lot of shame as well attached early, maybe to the parent or the carer of that particular child, because maybe they feel guilty or responsible for having exposed that child or to that particular danger, especially if it's something like, for example, a domestic violence issue, maybe some substance abuse, for example. Even if a person's kind of gone on and changed their life and then they've gotten clean, there may still be a shame in kind of discussing that kind of early period where maybe that child might have been exposed. And I think, just to reiterate what you said, it's really important to get professionals in to diagnose it. Obviously, we're aware that mental health services all over the country are really, really stretched. Some people choose to go private, which is, obviously very, very expensive as well. But, if some people are able to do that, I appreciate they kind of want the best for their child. But as you say, I think persistence is key. Not everybody can, and I'm definitely not advocating people to go private. I'm just saying it's there as an option. And you just have to kind of wait and be patient. But I think in the meantime, if you know your child, the teacher works quite closely with the class. In mainstream, it is difficult, having stepped down to my career in mainstream schools. I think unless you're told something about a particular child that has been identified, the best thing is that it kind of comes from home, and the home can explain. Often in those situations, it's quite extreme, and the child may be given a support worker or teaching assistant that works with them. Otherwise, it's just kind of like working with home and understanding what that child needed and what the triggers are. That's really important. as well.
I mean,
But there also are.
sorry, just commenting on some of these things actually, because thinking about childhood trauma and working with families, I think that's a really big well, if you like, to tackle, because if a child goes through that experience, first and foremost, you're having to get a family to admit that experience that experience was actually took place while that child was under your care, and then you have the perhaps the guilty feeling of feeling that you failed the child, and the shameful feeling upon you. But I think that one of the key things is that actually it is, I mean, it's a big question to ask. How do we tackle families? It's easier to approach the ASD or ADHD, where these are, if you like, they're perhaps in the gene pool, not necessarily family related, but something a bit more complex, scientific, if you like, an imbalance in the chemical imbalance in the brain. But when you have something that has been linked to your childhood, how do you as a parent then bring that to the table to discuss it, to be able to then get the necessary support? I think this is something that is going to be a really big issue to tackle, because asking for help is only once you admit that there's a problem. And who wants to admit that there's a problem?
Yeah, and I agree with you. And I think the biggest thing we need to say is that if you're seeking help from a professional, then it's part of their profession, part of their professional standard. It's not to judge. It's like going to any kind of professional, like going to a doctor. People aren't there to judge you, and I know it's quite difficult. They have to understand that that particular person there who's designated to help you just wants to help you and help that child and understand. And it's not about blaming. It's not about feeling shame. Obviously, these are natural things that a parent might feel. But it's about saying, look, this is the situation we're in. The early intervention is better, because then it can, the child can be given the tools to help, and also the parent can receive the right type of training to help them. Because if they've both been subjected to a traumatic event, then there's just help for both of them. So there's for example, there's cognitive behaviour therapy for both, for the parent and the child, or for the whole family if that's needed. There are different services, like for example, psychotherapy, which has been proven to be really effective in terms of, because what will tend to happen with a child that's been exposed to that kind of traumatic event is it's more than likely they'll experience mental health problems. They'll have attachment issues as well. They'll be, like I said, being very, very clingy, or the opposite, where they're just unable to form relationships with their peers. So where you might see other children happily playing, that's not going to be a safe environment, and because they probably have been exposed to adults. Yeah, definitely. And also, if you're exposed to relationships which were really, really unhealthy, where somebody could fly off the handle for the slightest thing, then you're going to be fearful of other people's reactions. So you might have a need within you to want to interact with other people, but you're also going to have that fear. And then obviously PTSD, as we mentioned before, that if there's something that triggers it, could be a smell, it could be a sight, it could be a sound, it could be a taste, it could be literally anything. And not understanding it, you might think, that child's picky, or that child is being disruptive or rude. And again, it's not about that. It's really understanding. And I think, as your previous caller said, you'll be able to tell pretty quickly when a child is playing up, and actually when a child is showing, a serious issue that needs, further help.
Okay, so Jazakallah khair, Sister Maysoon. Just to lastly read out that, obviously, we want to make sure that as a community we are approaching it and dealing with the stigma attached with all sorts of mental health illnesses, whether or not it's been from childhood trauma, or it's a mental condition on the ASD or ADHD. 3 or 4 key things that we need to make sure that we do as a community: show reliable information. That's something. Contact someone who would be an advocate, know your rights, and talk about your experience with your family. So get help. Look at the websites like the NHS, or if you like, on the autistic spectrum, the Autistic Spectrum Society website. Also, Mind is a website which has also got lots of support out there. And that's really what we need to do as a community. So for all the listeners who have been tuned into your education, your schooling, Jazakallah khair, and may Allah bless you. May Allah make it easy for us to continue the fast of Ramadan, and may Allah allow us to benefit from any knowledge that has been shared with the viewers, and may Allah forgive myself for anything that's been wrongly misinterpreted or shared or expressed on the station. Jazakallah khair again, Maysoon, for being on the line.
You're very welcome. Jazakallah. Ameen.
Okay, guests, listeners, that's Ziya Haq on your education, your schooling.
Visit us at